Mhm. Well, let's get started for the sake of time. Good evening, everybody. My name is Denitric Powers. I'm the Director of Planning and Engagement with NAO Partners. To start us off today, I'm going to pass it to uh, Kari. I'm saying that right. Is it Kari? Carrie?
It's
Uh,
50-50, Denitric. It's Carrie. Yeah.
Carrie. Carrie. Sorry about that. I'm going to pass it off to Carrie um, just to do an introduction and give everybody context about why the county is making this effort for this plan.
Thank you, Denitric. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We know that there's lots of opportunity to engage right now, especially when it comes to the COVID crisis and following the death of George Floyd. But we feel now more than ever that the availability of housing options is going to be more critical. As we start to really feel and experience the economic impacts of the COVID crisis. Again, the session this evening is focused on affordable housing, and this is one of many various topic areas of the Economic Competitiveness and Inclusion Plan. So I'm Carrie Collins. I'm the Director of Community and Economic Development at Ramsey County. There's a couple of us on the line who started with Ramsey County. We're a relatively new department to the county as of a year and a half ago or so. And at that time, it wasn't really established, economic development wasn't an established department. And the role of economic development at the county wasn't really established as well. So it was at that time that we started to think through the possibility of a vision plan with the intent to find opportunities to be more strategic in funneling resources. What we found was an opportunity not just to do a deep dive into what the county's role in economic development is going to be, but to say, how can we use this opportunity to really target race-based disparities within our regional economy. It was the first time that the county and the cities kind of came together to start looking at economic competitiveness as a regional aspiration. And as we think about economic development, we think about it in terms of housing development, affordable housing, not just from an ethical and moral consideration, but in terms of an economic advantage. And we started talking about workforce development and job growth, and we started talking about all the various aspects that make place. And so Ramsey County partnered with the Center for Economic Inclusion, partnered with Fourth Economy out of Pittsburgh and NAO Partners to really put together a comprehensive path in terms of engagement, in terms of various sections within the plan, to look at all of these kind of economic levers holistically, all the intersections, so that this didn't become another check on the box in terms of a comprehensive plan or some other plan that ends up on a shelf that you pull out once in a while. We wanted to really find an opportunity to figure out where can we grow jobs along transit lines, and also find opportunities for housing options and more housing availability, more affordability. And we know that the tools are limited, and we want to invite everybody to engage along this path, along this process. This is kind of the first public engagement opportunity for the public to kind of weigh in and share all of your ideas, but this won't be the end. You can engage all along the way. This is a journey. So we've got a whole variety of partners. We've got questions along the way. Denitric's going to be facilitating tonight's session, but the idea is not to work within the confines of affordable housing as we know it. The idea is to transform what we can do in terms of unique financing models, in terms of new opportunities to build supply, and to really be strategic so that we can be competitive, but we can also meet the needs of the community in the crisis around housing that we're experiencing right now, and to better position ourselves for the housing needs of the future. So with that, looking forward to the conversation this evening. And I'll turn it back over to you, Dimitri. Oh, you're on mute.
You'd think I'd be used to this already. Many Zoom meetings, everyone's probably done. As Carrie mentioned, we have a comprehensive group of players kind of leading the development of this plan, leading our economic competitiveness and inclusion aspect of the plan is Fourth Economy with the support of MZ Strategies. Josh is here from Fourth Economy along with Maria Zimmerman from MZ Strategies. They are leading our housing analysis and economic analysis, as well as helping us develop the implementation framework. Leading the equitable development aspect of the project is the Center for Economic Inclusion, supported by NAO partners and MZ Strategies. We are leading the community engagement, as well as offering strategic advisory and equity framework for the plan. Also joining the project is Urban 3, who will be conducting a fiscal health analysis, which is focused on property value and comparative analysis. Go to the next slide. There are 4 main phases to this project, which includes a research phase, informative phase, a building phase, and implementation phase. During our research phase, which was from February to May, is where we gathered, led by Fourth Economy, gathered all the economic analysis data to give us a baseline understanding of where is Ramsey County now in comparison to Hennepin County and the rest of the U.S. There was also a housing needs assessment done, which we'll dive into this evening, as well as an industry analysis, property and tax value analysis as well. Using that baseline economic understanding of the county, we will then, inform our understanding through engagement with multiple stakeholders to understand, what are the opportunities and challenges, where should the county focus, based on the data that we've pulled, as well as the community needs that we've uncovered, and then also getting an understanding of what is the existing ecosystem of resources and partners looks like. Once we, validate and broaden our perspective, we'll then be moving to a build phase in August and September, working with the steering committee, working group, and community action teams in order to address, how do we identify these challenges and opportunities, what tactical steps do we need to take to achieve the county's goals, and then what other, resources and partners are needed in order to achieve those goals. In October and November, we will then be moving to our implementation phase in order to, put together our strategy of, what does success look like and how do we measure it? How can we, evaluate our progress over time? And how do we create new resources in support of the plan? How are we ensuring local input? Through 3 main stakeholder groups. The first is our steering committee, which includes regional economic development leaders who are providing us feedback and strategic direction for our analysis, engagement, and implementation phases of the planning process. We're also working with private and nonprofit leaders within the region who are acting as advisors and helping us do our analysis and strategic thinking around our 4 focus areas, which includes jobs and industry, community wealth, housing development, and quality of place. And then our grassroots input is coming from our community action teams, which includes civic and private leaders, grassroots organizations, residents, in order to add context to our 4 focus areas, as well as supporting us, identifying the issues and prioritizing solutions. Speaking of our community action teams, the purpose of this community action team, as I mentioned, was to really get input from the grassroots level of the community in order to help us get a deeper understanding of what the issues and challenges are across our 4 focus areas. We are envisioning this community action team to be a group of 35 members and not to exceed that, to be a diverse representation of Ramsey County, with at least 5 per district. This group will convene for the first time in July in order to prioritize our areas of focus based on the data and input that we've gathered from community engagement up until that point. And then they'll join the working groups in August to help build and develop our strategies. And then they'll convene again in October to help provide more input around the implementation framework. One thing we want to understand from this meeting, apart from the community action team, is how do you envision Ramsey County incorporating community voice in its planning process? Not just in this process, but what does it look like for community voice to be a part of the project, past implementation? If you can, put your thoughts into the chat. We are taking notes and we'll be recording those. And then those notes will be also available on our website as well. And then also, if there's anything that you would like to say, we do want to limit our responses or questions to at least a minute, just because we have a limited amount of time this evening. But please open up your participant list and use the raise your hand function, and one of us will chime you in order for you to provide some input or any thoughts that you may have. There's no initial thoughts or questions, then I'll pass it on to Josh, who's going to be leading us in our data presentation this evening around housing development and affordability.
Thank you so much, Denitric. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh. I'm with Fourth Economy Consulting. We are an economic development strategy firm based out of Pittsburgh, where we do work all throughout the country, and we are really excited to be working closely with Ramsey County and all of its partners to develop an economic development plan to position the region and the county for growth over the next 5 to 10 years. My role today is simply to share with you some key insights that we are learning and continuing to learn as we develop and finalize our housing needs assessment that's underway. Before we get into the data, would love for all of you to also consider and think about, as you are going through the data slides, what housing related opportunities or issues would you like to see us address in the plan? All of you have signed on to this webinar because you have some interest or stake within housing across your community and with your constituents. So we want to hear from you. We want to understand what conversations you're having and how those conversations can inform our work as we move along. So feel free to use the chat box while we're going through these slides, and also use the chat box to ask any questions you might have, and we'll find some time to address them as we move along. So our team took a look at housing and rental values across the county between the years of 2014 and 2018, which is the most recent data. And what we're finding in that data is that home values in most cities across the county have increased by at least 10% or more. North Oaks region is an outlier, which is what you see to the far right there. And so is, in some cases, Gem Lake. Just to keep these values in perspective, Gem Lake has experienced a little bit over 15% growth in home values over the past few years. So their median home values are greater than about 300,000 K. You also see some communities in this particular graph that have increased home values, but below 7.5%. So there's that cluster on the far left there, with communities like Arden Hills, North St. Paul, and even Falcon Heights. Transitioning from home values to rent values, we also see increases in rental values by about 8% or more for most counties. Again, North Oaks is an outlier here. They had an increase in rents above 30% over the past few years. Gem Lake is also an outlier, but you don't see it on the graph because they've actually decreased their rent by about 13%, but within that region, there's very few rental units, which is why it's a bit of an outlier. We've learned throughout this analysis that the highest value of residential properties are actually clustered around the lakes in the northeast of the county. And within St. Paul, most of the high value residential properties are in the western part of the city. So as rent and housing values rise across the county, we oftentimes think about, well, what does that mean in terms of affordability? So we define cost burden households as households that are paying more than 30% of its income to house the cost. So that includes things like rent and mortgage, utilities and insurance, for example. So for the county, there are more than 67,000 households that are considered a cost burden. Those who are cost burdened, those households who are cost burdened, they're earning 50% AMI or less. What the data shows us is what you see here, is that the majority of the cost burdened households are white. They're making up about 32% of all cost burdened households. But what the data also shows is that though Blacks make up about 4% of the total cost burdened households across the county, 48% of African American households outside of St. Paul are cost burdened. And that trend you see also likewise for Asians and Hispanics within the county. When you consider housing types across the county, Ramsey also has a bit of a lower home ownership rate than the state, the region, and the neighboring Hennepin County. What we also know about Ramsey County that it has more renters and lower value homes than its neighboring Hennepin County. What you see in this chart on this slide here is that the majority of the cost burden households are actually renter households. This trend is true for cost burden households that are making less than 50% AMI. So when you begin to look at housing types above 50% AMI, it kind of switches. There are more cost burden owner households than renters, but that's not true for those folks who are making less than 50% AMI. So what we know about the affordability issue that it's actually a renter issue. And despite relatively low rents and low rental increases across the county over the past few years, the county does have a high rate of cost burden, or a high rate of rental population that's cost burden than the region at large. When you take a look at renters demographically, you can see within this chart here that about 80% of cost burden renters are actually of working age. That's represented in the blue that you see in the pie chart to the left. What you also know, and what the data also reveals, is that 93% of cost burden renters are actually earning less than $50,000, and that's noted in the red in the pie chart to the right. So in addition to the challenge of income and households, in affordability in households, when it comes to the type of rental buildings the county is working on developing or improving, and by the county I mean the developers within the county, you see that monthly rents per bedroom is important to note here. The average median rent is about $969 across the county. And most 2-bedrooms cost maybe around $750 more a month. The 3-bedrooms typically cost about $1,000 or more a month. So what we know and what the data shows us is that because there are income disparities, particularly related to Black and Indigenous people of color, that this graph shows that there are more 2-bedroom units that rent more than $1,000 than there are 2-bedroom units that rent for less than that. And these numbers are really important when you are considering who do you want to develop rental properties or housing units for, and how affordable can they be depending on who you are and the kind of income that you make throughout the county per year. So how has the county responded to the affordability gaps in housing? We've taken a look at population and employment projections that have been published by the Met Council well into 2040. Those populations that are both regional in scope, but also within communities across the county. And when you couple these projections with affordable housing production numbers, or the pace at which affordable units have been produced historically, then you'll find that production is not necessarily keeping up with demand. The data shows in this particular chart that an annual average of about 1,300 affordable units have been produced since 2010. And if that pace of development continues to grow, while the projections of population and industry growth holds true, we know that there will be an existing gap or need for more units for households that are at or below 30% AMI. And calculated by unit, that gap is about 15,000 or more units. It's important to consider here then, as we continue throughout this planning process, is this gap in units, is this a supply problem? Is it a problem related to low wages and the need to increase wages for communities of color or those who are making below that 50% AMI? Or is this just a problem of subsidy and incentive and the need to kind of develop new models of financing to support affordable housing? All of this data and the numbers that you see, they don't necessarily account for example, Ramsey County's homelessness population or those in emergency shelters and supportive housing, even senior housing and aging infrastructure that we see in the suburbs. It also doesn't yet consider how COVID has truly impacted households and what that might mean for residents who are kind of seeking more affordable accommodations. So as we begin to engage with partners in this work, a lot of them have expressed that in addition to thinking about housing development and preservation, we must also think about the services and programs that exist across that housing continuum. The team has adopted this framework that's been developed by the Minnesota Housing Task Force, which really includes a focus not just on development, but on services and home stability. How is the county working to prevent evictions? How are they working to reduce the burden of increasing rents across the county? There's been also a great focus around strengthening pathways towards homeownership. So we want to continue to model this framework and think about those things as we move along in our process here. It's also, equally important for the team to consider, housing needs for Ramsey County across the AMI continuum. So the needs of renter households below 30% AMI will be different than seniors or aging population or those who are cost burden above 50% AMI. What you see here is a housing continuum published by the Minnesota Housing Partnership. And we're using this as a model to just be comprehensive in our analysis of housing, to not just include who's within these AMI thresholds, but who are those people? What are they experiencing? What types of housing can support this kind of development? And who are the strategies and partners to come alongside of the county, as Carrie mentioned earlier, to make this happen? So in summary, what does this all mean? So not only is the population growing in Ramsey County, but demographically it's changing. And individuals and families who will now need housing assistance because of COVID, that's also changing. And that's putting a unique demand on the county in thinking about how it's enhancing its existing portfolio of housing, but also new development. And we're not just looking at housing in a vacuum. As Carrie mentioned earlier, it's also about how housing relates to things like transportation investment or existing and future job centers across the county. And that intersectionality will play itself out as we move along here. What's also important to note that there still exists some income disparities across race and ethnicity within the county. So it's really important for the county to think strategically and smart about development, particularly development that doesn't cause displacement and development that doesn't quite ignore those who need housing the most across that county. So it's our hope that we can work alongside with the county to really help them understand, how does housing growth work given the very limited available land? Or how can we create a more favorable financial and incentive environment for affordable development? What exists beyond, for example, CDBG dollars or TIF financing to actually support development? And the good news is that the county is still relatively affordable, and it has an abundance of natural occurring affordable housing properties that can truly be leveraged to support affordable development. The county is also open to new funding sources. For example, the St. Paul's Affordable Housing Incentive Program. How is St. Paul using this tool to support development? How can the suburbia Ramsey County model this particular work? What are the other out-of-the-box innovative financing models that exist? And of course, as we move along, working closely with housing partners who are already having these kind of discussions are of the utmost priority for the county, all of them of which are willing to really address some of the housing goals that exist in truly preparing Ramsey County for future growth. So before we move on here, I wanted to pause to kind of field any questions you all might have and or think about any kind of opportunities or assets that the data doesn't quite show that it will be important for us to include as well. So I'll pause and take any questions if there be any.
Josh, we had a question from Allison Berry, who was wondering if the cost burden numbers represent both rental and home ownership stats. I know you had the one slide that broke it out generally, but when you were talking about cost burden by different racial groups, I'm wondering if there was also a breakout
Sure.
by owner versus renter.
That's a really great question. And I think the cost burden numbers that was presented in the slide were for just all housing, both rental and home ownership. But I can make sure that I provide some more nuanced details in terms of the cost burden breakdown between rental versus just owner households. I'll do that.
This is Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, so how do you guys define what's affordable to someone? Because I think you touched on it briefly, but income disparities are a big problem, and just because you have the label on there affordable doesn't make it actually affordable to the people who are needing housing. For example, my 25-year-old stepkid is has been in housing situations where there's no way they can live on their own with the income that they make. So they have to room with somebody else and maybe multiple somebody else's. So how do you balance those things?
Sure. That's a really great question. And I think it's a question that we should continue to define as we kind of engage with housing partners in terms of what we mean in terms of affordability. I think our data team has taken a look at the living wage calculations of Ramsey County, and comparing living wage to kind of average median income within the county. I noted earlier that we define cost burden or households that are cost burdened are those that are making kind of below 50% AMI, the median income. And I think if my memory serves me correctly, the median income for Ramsey County is maybe around $65,000, $70,000, and I can double check that. But we take that number and then we compare it to things like the living wage, and we compare it to income levels across all races and ethnicity, and use that kind of analysis to further justify and improve or inform what affordability means and looks like in the community. But I think that's a great question to bring up, and one that's worth continuing to define as we move along.
Thanks. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that with so many government workers here in Ramsey County, our income levels are by definition probably higher than they would be otherwise. And also, it also increases the tax burden on home ownership, something to definitely keep in mind as far as affordability goes. I own my own house, and my tax burden has gone up significantly in the last 2 years alone. So it makes housing less affordable. So
that's a great point. And we'd love to even continue to engage folks, even on the call, in terms of how they're defining what affordability is and looks like in the work that you're doing, and maybe drawing from that insight and from that analysis to inform our work, for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, I'm wondering if you have time for one more question too, from Allison Berry again. She's got great questions here. She's wondering if there's any data on rental rate regulations in Minnesota. She's had a hard time tracking that down.
Sure, that's a great question. And I don't have a clear answer on that, but I can certainly take that question back to our data team and see if we can pull some research for you and some sources for you.
To my knowledge, there is virtually none. I've also looked and haven't been able to find much. So I'd be curious as to if anybody else has found any data around rental rate regulations, specifically here in Minnesota. I know that there's data in other places. I believe places like California may have more data, but that's also an area that has more experience with kind of regulating rent.
Great, awesome. Well, I'll try to continue to field some questions in the chat box while I'll turn it back over to Dimitri.
So Maria Zimmerman is actually going to facilitate our discussion. She has extensive experience in affordable housing and policy and is currently leading that work for us on this project. So I'm going to pass that on to her, but I may chime in for some comments or questions to the group. Off to you, Maria.
Great, thanks, Dimitri. Yes, and hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. And I know we have great group here, both with lived experience and some of you who on your day jobs also spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. So thank you. The question we wanted to explore, and again, kind of with Carrie's context of thinking about how we can be bolder and more innovative in thinking about models, and particularly the role that the county can play, either directly through its financing and financing tools, or through how it works with local jurisdictions who really at the forefront of some of the regulatory and land control issues and other things. So we'd love to get your thoughts on this question about what will it take to provide more affordable housing opportunities for communities and people who need them. And as we think about this question, keeping in mind the slides that Josh showed, that we have both high growth communities where population and jobs are currently increasing and are projected to continue to increase, at least pre-COVID. Those are what the numbers were telling us. And then we also have communities that have had lower growth and have had a harder time increasing housing production, locating jobs into those communities as well. And so we'd really just kind of like to open up, first of all, with this question to kind of get your general thoughts about, again, this could be from your day job experience or just as a homeowner or renter, person living, working in the county. What are some of the tools that you think the county could really step forward? And again, they may be financing, they may be policy, they may be through partnership. So I'll pause there, and you're welcome to share your ideas in the chat, or you can raise your hand at the bottom of the screen. If you take your little arrow and you bring it down, you should see the little control panel that shows participants. And if you click on that and you find yourself, and you can just click on the raise hand icon. And so if you want to raise your hand, we'll verbally call on you and have you share your thoughts on this question, or you can just put it in the chat box. So Lucy Galbraith, love to hear, Lucy, what your thought is. I see your hand is raised.
Okay, thank you, Maria. And this is mostly from other places, something that I've seen that seems to work well, that the county and cities can do is specify what is wanted so that developers aren't guessing. And you can do it with form code or whatever, but say, this is what we want in here. And, the developers will generally do something what you want if they can make the numbers run and get it through the process faster. But when they have to guess, and this you know, all of us in planning have seen this happen where a developer shows something, it's rejected, they come back with another one, it's rejected, and every single loop is adding huge cost to the project, which makes it hard for them to do something affordable in their field. Now they'll do it if it's, you know, if the rents are high enough, but this is something that policy can control. The other thing that policy can control, and it also, I mean, it works out better. Everybody says this is what we want in our neighborhood, and the developers can try to do that. The other thing is to Austin, Texas did this at one point where they set up an internal process that had a single person assigned to a project to get it through all the different departments. And they gave timelines, they had deadlines. Now there were possibilities for extensions, but it just reduced the uncertainty for developers. And again, there are a lot of costs associated with that. So those are two pure policy things that will not solve the problem. There's no, as far as I know, as far as I've seen, no silver bullet, but that can be put in place and help the community get what it wants while the developers can actually build stuff. So that's a suggestion.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks for sharing that, and also appreciate the reference to some examples from other communities. That's part of what we're doing as well, is to look at some of the emerging practices from other places that we think could hold promise to be adapted here for Ramsey County. Sarah Harris, I see you have your hand up as well, so I'd love to hear what's on your mind.
Thanks, Maria, and everybody. This is going to sound self-serving because AN is currently pursuing 2 acquisitions of NOAA properties in Roseville right now, but it's not self-serving, it's practical experience that's speaking. We are currently losing more NOAA units than we are able to build in new development. And so we actually have a net loss before you start even thinking about increasing population and other such things. So we can't build our way out of this. We need to start making sure that the properties that are currently affordable stay affordable. And the challenge there is that in order to compete with the market, who is also trying to acquire these properties, we have to be nimble. Sometimes these properties need to close within 90 to 120 days, and the funding sources that are available for NOAA properties, which are few and far between, are not nimble enough to meet those timelines, A. B, the economics of these NOAA properties, let's face it, a lot of the properties that are up for sale because they've been well used, but not necessarily well loved in all circumstances. And so they need significant renovation, and it's a cost that is not supported by the income from the property if we keep it affordable. So there's going to be a gap in what can be financed on these properties. And we need to identify either credit enhancement programs that a significant, an agency with significant credit can help us with. There could be opportunities to pool funds so that they are ready and can be acted upon in a nimble fashion, so they are in essence pre-approved for these types of uses. We could have the counties and cities working with local groups of philanthropy and corporate users to pool funds so that this isn't a self-serving ask by an individual company trying to fund one property, but rather municipalities trying to pool smaller amounts of funds from bigger organizations so that we can have these funds ready. There are a whole host of ways we could look at, but what we ultimately need to do is bring low or no cost funds to help us acquire and keep these properties affordable, or we are going to not only not make headway in affordable housing, we're actually losing ground.
Thank you, Sarah. And I see we have a comment here. I'm sorry, it just says SL20 about more programs that give low-income renters direct subsidies for housing. And I'd love if you have more you want to share with us on that. I'm curious if you're thinking about, things like the housing choice vouchers and how we can get more of those, or if you're thinking about emergency rental assistance, especially right now when a lot of renters are facing real fears about eviction, especially when the moratorium lifts. So would love if there's any more you want to share with us on that that comment. I really appreciate you bringing up the issue of renters who need direct supports.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking so much the emergency rental help, because if you do a program like that, a lot of times a person needs to have an eviction notice already in hand, right? So they're already so close to being homeless that it can be very frustrating for a person who's in an emergency but doesn't want to get completely underwater. So I was thinking more along the lines of, you know, some help that goes to the housing development, but it's based on the renter. It's not based on necessarily the property.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that. I'm also curious, one of the things we've been talking about and the county is thinking about, given some of the work of the Rondo Land Trust and others, is if there's more that we could be doing and thinking about regarding land trusts and land banking, especially if we look across the county and not just in St. Paul, and would welcome if there's anyone here on the call who has thoughts or ideas regarding kind of this idea of community ownership, public lands, land trust, land banking options. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. Or anything else you'd like to bring up. I don't mean to in any way stifle the conversation.
I think I'm going to chime in. Keith Baker.
Hi, Keith.
Hi, how are you? I'm leading the effort to do a project that is the Rondo Land Bridge over the freeway, the creation of new land. It has the potential of being 21 acres, in part, park space, etc. So this idea of community ownership becomes very, very important, noting the history of what's taken place with 94. But more than anything, a concept that is called air rights. Who owns the rights of any development that might come should the proposition emerge forward? It also begs the question, who are the developers and or the co-developers as a way to manage any displacement or gentrification? The other piece that I think is also important is when we think about the partnership that's required. Certainly the space itself is controlled by MnDOT, but the county, the city, and Met Council all have a stake in what MnDOT might view as a transportation project, infrastructure, but that probably should be viewed much broader, similar to the conversation here, particularly because of landlocked issues in the central part of the city. So there are a number of considerations around ownership and the way it can happen. And even when you talk about financing of development projects are important, because oftentimes when you're dealing with affordable housing, you're using different colors of money. And there are great complexities to the management and transactions around those types of money. And that's partly what makes it difficult to scale up affordable housing and to put together project deals, whether you're using the land trust, the Rondo Land Trust, and Greg and I have spoken a bit about this. So there are limitations with existing models. And so re-examining how land trusts can have interactions with other kind of financing models, I think are really important, particularly those that can hold different colors of money. So I'll rest my comments there.
Those are great. Thank you, Keith. Thank you. And thanks for joining us for a second night. Woo-hoo.
Oh, sure. I'll be here tomorrow too.
That's terrific. And Sarah Harris, I see your hand is up. I'm not sure if that's from before or if you had an additional thought on this or another topic.
I was just going to echo what Keith was saying and note that maybe 2 years ago, ULI did a technical advisory panel at the direction of Commissioner Zelli, then Commissioner of MnDOT, to look at all of the basically vacant land owned by MnDOT, as well as how MnDOT undertakes its renovation and complete reconstruction of freeways, 94 corridor being one. Rondo was one of the neighborhoods that was involved in that advisory panel, and making sure that those types of major infrastructure projects were done to knit communities together rather than just kind of cut through them. And also how the that land can be put back into service into the community. So that's another way to answer part of what you were talking about, Keith.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we have time for one more question I want to pose to this group, and would love any and all thoughts, again, verbally or in the chat box. And that's really around decreasing the demand for affordable housing. So again, thinking about kind of the economic component of people and in the county. And so either if we think about ways that we can help existing renters stabilize income, stabilize their housing opportunities, or increasing opportunities to preserve affordable units and help households increase their chances of becoming, moving from renting to ownership. So would love thoughts that people might have both about how we can stabilize existing stock and stabilize economic opportunities for the renters, and our programs or opportunities to help people affordably move from renting into ownership. So welcome, feel free to raise your hand or put comments in the chat box on that. And Courtney, thank you. Courtney says, Housing Institute is maybe not the exact plan model that makes sense in the urban environment, but a collaborative approach might lend value. So that's the last question, no problem. But if you want to say more on that, Courtney, feel free. Or again, we really would love, given we're looking into the percentage of what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. There's a percentage of that's single family housing. And if we also think about opportunities for duplexes, triplexes, how can we kind of reimagine our approaches that also look at opportunities for wealth creation of those who are currently renting and building that wealth asset?
One other thing that comes to mind is that we're exploring is building are things like building material, sustainability, all of the elements that can help in the saving modular builds, as an example as well. Really taking a look at ways of creating energy efficiencies, which also help meet affordability needs. So really this push towards green is very critical, I think, in the conversation around affordability. Because to some extent, just using solar energy just as an illustration, there's no reason why solar gardening can't be maximized. And the distribution of the gardening of the energy distributed, which also lessens the demand on people with limited incomes.
Well, and we'd love, again, like as this project moves forward, if there are additional thoughts and ideas that people have on this. I know as we think about displacement, again, we saw the data trends that the pre-COVID for sure rents in particular were rising, and displacement can happen both from underinvested communities where there's been the lack of opportunity. Housing costs are still becoming unattainable for folks because their incomes aren't rising. Displacement can also happen when rents and housing costs are going up and incomes are not keeping pace with that either. So there's kind of both the displacement that happens from disinvestment, lack of economic opportunity, as well as displacement from those market trends and pressures. And I see as Consuelo notes here, yes, indeed, all of the topics this week are very much interconnected. As yesterday we talked about jobs, today we're talking about housing, we'll be talking about community wealth building and place-based assets over the next 2 nights as well. So maybe that's a good segue to pass it back to you, Denitric, to wrap us up here tonight.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thank everyone for their input. There really was interesting questions that I'm sure if more of you had time to kind of think on and dwell on, that you have some really great input. So just remember, you can still give that input on our website. I dropped the link into the chat. It may have been lost, but I will send it out again. And if you haven't already, please take the survey on the website as well. Enter your thoughts that are on the forum that's on the website. As Consuelo mentioned, all of these topics are interconnected. There's no reason that we have to think about them in a silo, especially when we talk about, decreasing the demand for affordable housing. How do we increase people's opportunity, to stabilize through, decreasing unemployment, decreasing underemployment, coming up with creative and innovative strategies around, wealth building. Again, we will send all of these. The slides will be on our website, as well as the recording of this video as well. And now you should see an email as a follow-up to this meeting in the morning that I have a link to that website with those documents on there. Again, if you have any further questions or thoughts, or just like to connect, to have a more in-depth discussion around any topic that you feel wasn't able to be discussed here tonight, you can email me personally, and we can make that happen. With that being said, if there aren't any last thoughts or comments, we can conclude our meeting this evening. And we hope to see you at our meeting tomorrow, Community Wealth Building. It may be an excellent opportunity to build on this conversation around affordable housing. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.